The Roman Empire began in the most humble of circumstances, a small settlement on the banks of the Tiber River, founded in the year 753 BC. According to legend, the story of Rome's birth is one of myth. Twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, abandoned at birth and raised by a she-wolf, their tale symbolizing the resilience and defiance that would come to define the city. From these legendary beginnings, Rome would rise, step by step, from a small city-state into the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But the greatness of Rome would not come easily, nor would it last forever. The seeds of its eventual fall were already planted in its earliest moments. The early Romans were a hardy people, faced with harsh conditions and even harsher neighbors. The Etruscans, the Sabines, and other tribes posed constant threats, but the Romans were determined to survive, and so they built. They built not just to defend themselves, but to conquer. By 509 BC, Rome had overthrown the monarchy that ruled over it and had established the Roman Republic. This marked the beginning of a new era, one where power was divided and shared, no longer in the hands of a single ruler, but among elected officials and magistrates. The Roman Republic was unique in that it blended elements of democracy with aristocracy. The Senate, the assembly of elected officials, became the central institution, making decisions that shaped the lives of all Romans. Rome's political system was designed to keep power from consolidating in any one individual. The magistrates, elected for one-year terms, were tasked with leading Rome's armies, managing its finances, and administering its laws. The consuls, two at a time, represented the highest level of political power and were meant to balance each other out, ensuring that no one could wield unchecked authority. This division of power was a reflection of Roman values, values that placed the state above all else, that emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice. For several centuries, the Republic expanded, first through war and then through diplomacy. The Romans were expert soldiers, renowned for their discipline and innovation. The Roman legions, the backbone of the Republic's military might, were highly organized, each soldier a trained warrior, capable of performing feats that were unimaginable to the tribes around them. The Romans fought countless wars to defend and expand their territory. The conquest of the Italian peninsula was followed by wars against Carthage, the Punic Wars, which would see Rome emerge victorious, with its most famous general, Scipio Africanus, defeating the legendary Hannibal. But Rome's reach was not limited to military conquest. As it expanded, it also absorbed the cultures, technologies, and knowledge of the lands it conquered, creating a melting pot of ideas and practices that would come to define the Roman world. By the time of the 1st century BC, Rome's influence stretched across much of the Mediterranean world. The Romans controlled vast territories, from the fertile plains of Gaul to the deserts of Egypt. The Republic had grown beyond its original borders, but so too had the challenges of maintaining that growth. The very system of government that had worked for centuries now began to show signs of strain. As the empire expanded, so did its complexities. The Senate, once a symbol of Roman democracy, became riddled with corruption. Political infighting and the growing power of wealthy families led to instability, and the once strong political system began to falter. The Republic's problems came to a head with the rise of powerful generals who, having led successful campaigns on the frontier, came to dominate the political scene. The most notable of these men were Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, three figures whose ambitions would ultimately destroy the delicate balance that had existed in the Republic for centuries. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC, his march on Rome, and his eventual appointment as dictator for life marked the end of the Republic and the beginning of the empire. Rome would never again be ruled by elected officials chosen by the people. Power had shifted to the hands of one man, and the Republic was no more. Caesar's assassination in 44 BC was supposed to restore the Republic, but in reality, it only set the stage for a new round of civil wars. Ultimately, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, emerged victorious. Augustus, with careful political maneuvering, became the first emperor of Rome in 27 BC, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire. His rise to power was not one of brute force, but one of subtlety and strategy. Augustus did not declare himself king. Instead, he presented himself as the first among equals, preserving the outward appearance of the republic while consolidating power in his hands. The Senate, though still intact, held little real authority. Augustus ruled Rome with an iron fist, but he knew that maintaining the illusion of republican ideals was key to keeping the peace. The reign of Augustus ushered in an era of unprecedented stability and prosperity, known as the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. For more than 2 centuries, the empire thrived. Rome expanded its territories even further, from the British Isles to the Arabian deserts. Under Augustus and his successors, such as Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius, the empire reached the height of its territorial expanse and cultural influence. The Roman army, now under imperial control, was the most powerful fighting force the world had ever seen. Roman legions, disciplined and unwavering, ensured that the frontiers were protected and that the empire's dominance remained uncontested. The Pax Romana also saw extraordinary advancements in infrastructure, engineering, and the arts. The Romans built monumental structures, roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, that still stand today as testaments to their engineering genius. Roman law was codified, establishing a system of justice that would influence legal systems for millennia. The arts flourished as well, with poets like Virgil and Horace, and historians like Livy and Tacitus, shaping the cultural legacy of Rome for generations to come. But as Rome grew, so too did its challenges. The sheer size of the empire presented problems that no one had anticipated. The military that had once been its strength now became a source of strain. With such a vast empire to govern, the Roman legions were spread thin, guarding borders that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Arabia. The empire had grown too large to be governed by one central authority, and the once unified government began to show signs of disarray. Provincial leaders, once loyal to Rome, now began to assert their own authority, and military generals grew more powerful, often overthrowing emperors to seize power for themselves. Internal political strife became a constant feature of Roman life. The Senate, once the heart of Roman government, became a shadow of its former self. Corruption seeped into the highest levels of power, and the values that had once made Rome great, duty, honor, sacrifice, began to erode. The Roman military, once the symbol of unity and strength, became increasingly politicized, with generals securing their positions through force rather than merit. The virtues of the Roman citizen, once central to the Republic's success, began to fade. By the 3rd century AD, the empire was in crisis. The crisis of the 3rd century saw Rome beset by internal civil wars, economic turmoil, and external threats from barbarian invasions. The military, once Rome's greatest asset, became a liability. Emperors were frequently overthrown by military coups, and the empire split into several competing factions. The Roman economy, too, suffered from rampant inflation, overtaxation, and a reliance on slave labor, which stifled innovation and productivity. Despite these challenges, the Roman Empire endured for centuries. The Western Roman Empire, however, would eventually fall in 476 AD, marking the end of an era. The fall of Rome, though, was not the result of a single event. It was the culmination of centuries of slow decay, the result of internal weaknesses, external pressures, and the slow erosion of the very ideals that had once made Rome great. And so Rome fell, not in a single cataclysmic event, but over the course of generations. It was a slow, agonizing decline, one that began long before the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD. The seeds of decline were planted in the Republic itself, in the very system of government that had once allowed Rome to flourish. And though the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for another 1,000 years. But the story of the Roman Empire is not just one of military conquest and political intrigue. It is a story of how even the mightiest of empires can collapse under the weight of their own success. As the years passed, the Roman Empire's grandeur continued to shine, but beneath its impressive surface, there were cracks in the foundation. The Pax Romana, that remarkable period of peace and prosperity, eventually began to fade. The empire, which had once been united in its strength and purpose, now faced an increasingly complex web of challenges. What had begun as a model of governance built on civic duty, a shared vision of greatness, and military dominance, began to show the early signs of internal disarray. The seeds of decay, once small and unnoticed, began to sprout, threatening the stability of one of the world's most powerful civilizations. By the 3rd century AD, the political and social structures of the empire were starting to unravel. The once robust Roman Senate, which had once served as the backbone of the Republic, now struggled to maintain any meaningful influence. The emperors, too, seemed unable to keep the empire together. Political infighting, economic instability, and external threats compounded by the vastness of the Roman world led to a growing sense of disillusionment. The first of these signs appeared in the form of military usurpations. The Roman army, once a unified and disciplined force, had begun to splinter. Generals, once loyal to the emperor, now found themselves wielding power as they realized that military strength could grant them the throne. No longer was Rome ruled purely by the Senate or by emperors who came to power through political means. The army was the true seat of power, and whoever controlled the legions could declare themselves emperor. This situation, of course, led to chaos. The crisis of the 3rd century, which began in 235 AD, was marked by nearly 50 years of turmoil. In this period, there were no fewer than 26 emperors, most of whom were killed in military coups or assassinations. The empire seemed to teeter on the brink of collapse. The army became the decisive force in Roman politics, and the legitimacy of the emperors was now determined not by their skill or wisdom, but by their ability to command the loyalty of the soldiers. The question of leadership was no longer a matter of public service, but one of military conquest. As the empire faced this constant turnover of rulers, internal divisions deepened. The vast territories that had once been unified under a single Roman banner now seemed to be a burden rather than a strength. The empire had expanded so far, covering such vast regions, that the emperor's ability to govern from a single center was increasingly limited. The Mediterranean world, once a seamless entity under Roman rule, began to fracture along regional lines. The rise of local military leaders, each with their own agendas and ambitions, made it increasingly difficult to maintain a unified government. One of the most significant challenges came from the sheer size of the empire itself. Rome had expanded beyond its ability to govern. The borders stretched across Europe, North Africa, and Asia, making it impossible for a single emperor to oversee the entire territory. The empire was vulnerable, with the legions spread thinly across its borders, protecting far-off frontiers from barbarian invasions and internal uprisings. In truth, it had become too large to control effectively. Meanwhile, the economic structure that had supported the Roman Empire was beginning to falter. Rome's economy had been largely based on agricultural production, supported by a vast system of slavery. However, as the empire expanded, it began to face increasing difficulties in maintaining a steady supply of slaves. Furthermore, the economic disparity between the wealthy elite and the lower classes widened. The nobles, who held the land and the wealth, grew richer while the plebeians, who formed the backbone of the workforce, were left in relative poverty. The cost of maintaining the army, building monumental structures, and supporting an ever-growing bureaucracy drained the empire's resources. Roman citizens, once proud and loyal to the state, became disillusioned by the endless cycle of wars and political corruption. The political system, once designed to ensure accountability, had become a breeding ground for ambition and greed. The wealthy class began to withdraw into their private estates, no longer interested in the welfare of the people or the stability of the state. They built lavish homes and enjoyed luxury, while the empire around them began to crumble. But the decline was not just political and economic. It was also cultural. As the empire spread, It absorbed diverse cultures and peoples, many of whom had little loyalty to Rome or its ideals. This melting pot of cultures, while one of Rome's greatest strengths during its expansion, now began to fragment the empire's unity. The Roman identity, which had once been forged through shared values of duty, honor, and civic responsibility, began to fade. In its place came a sense of disillusionment, as citizens began to question the very ideals that had once made Rome great. The social fabric that had once bound the Roman Empire together began to fray. The traditional Roman virtues, pietas, devotion to gods, family and state, virtus, excellence and courage, and fides, faithfulness, which had once been the foundation of Roman life, became distant ideals. The decline in these virtues was seen not only in the behavior of the elites, but also in the conduct of ordinary citizens. The devotion to duty, once central to Roman life, began to erode, and with it, the strength of the Roman state. This loss of civic pride and the rise of individualism contributed to the weakening of the social contract. People began to focus more on personal gain than on the common good. Rome, once a city that prided itself on its unity, now saw its citizens more divided than ever. As the empire staggered through the 3rd century, the external threats only grew stronger. The Germanic tribes, who had once been on the periphery of Roman concerns, now became a real and imminent danger. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks pressed against the borders, pushing deeper into Roman territory. The Huns, led by the fearsome Attila, struck terror across the empire. The Romans, once the mightiest warriors in the world, found themselves struggling to defend their own borders. Yet, even as these barbarian forces gathered at the gates, Rome still clung to the hope of its imperial grandeur. In the midst of the crisis, a leader emerged, Diocletian, who sought to restore the empire to its former strength. In 284 AD, he came to power and attempted to implement sweeping reforms. He divided the empire into 2 halves, the Western Roman Empire governed from Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire governed from Byzantium, later known as Constantinople. Diocletian hoped this division would make it easier to govern and defend the empire, but in reality, it only hastened its fragmentation. The Eastern Empire would eventually survive, but the Western Empire would continue to crumble under the weight of its problems. Diocletian also introduced economic reforms, attempting to curb inflation and stabilize the currency. However, these measures had limited success, as the economic problems ran much deeper than simple fiscal policy could solve. Despite his efforts, Diocletian's reign ended in 305 AD, and with his departure, the empire once again fell into disarray. The real turning point in Rome's internal struggle came under the rule of Constantine, who became emperor in 306 AD. Constantine was one of the most remarkable figures in Roman history. His reign marked a shift in the cultural and religious landscape of the empire. Constantine's decision to embrace Christianity, which had previously been persecuted by the Roman state, changed the course of history. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians and laying the groundwork for Christianity to become the dominant religion of the empire. But even Constantine's reforms could not save the empire from the deep-seated issues it faced. The military, once the empire's strength, was no longer as cohesive or loyal as it had been in the past. The economy, still based on an over-reliance on slave labor, remained stagnant, and the political system, though reorganized, still struggled with corruption and inefficiency. Constantine's greatest achievement was his establishment of Constantinople as the new capital of the empire. Situated on the crossroads of Europe and Asia, Constantinople was ideally positioned to defend against the threats of the East and serve as a thriving cultural and political hub. However, the move also symbolized the increasing divide between the eastern and western parts of the empire. Despite his reforms and his efforts to secure the future of Rome, Constantine could not halt the inevitable decline. The empire, once a shining example of military and cultural superiority, had become too large, too fragmented, and too weakened to survive in its current form. It was only a matter of time before the forces of barbarism would break through its borders, and the Roman Empire, in its Western incarnation, would fall. The Roman Empire, once an unshakable pillar of power, was now entering a period that would forever change its fate. The grand architecture, the magnificent roads, the booming economy, these were the things that had made Rome the envy of the ancient world. But as the years wore on, these outward symbols of strength began to fade. The machinery of empire, once finely tuned and efficient, started to grind slowly to a halt, crushed under the weight of its own complexity. By the time of the 5th century, the Roman world was a shadow of what it had been at the height of its glory. The Western Roman Empire, struggling with internal strife, economic decay, and external invasions, was on the brink of collapse. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, remained strong and would eventually evolve into the Byzantine Empire. But the West, the heart of Roman power, was falling apart. The crisis of the 3rd century, which had started in the 230 SAD, had set the stage for what would follow. The empire, racked by civil wars, inflation, and barbarian invasions, had been pulled apart. The political system that had once been so organized and disciplined was now in chaos. Military coups, assassinations, and usurpations were commonplace. The very men who were supposed to protect the empire, the generals, became its greatest threat, seizing power for themselves and plunging Rome into a cycle of violence. At the heart of the crisis was the Roman military, which had always been the foundation of the empire's power. The legions had once been highly disciplined, their loyalty unquestioned, but that loyalty began to wane. The army, now filled with soldiers from distant lands, was no longer composed of citizens who fought for the glory of Rome. These soldiers were mercenaries, many of whom had little allegiance to Rome or its ideals. They fought for pay, not for loyalty to the emperor or the Roman state. This shift in military structure had serious consequences. As the army's loyalty became more tenuous, the emperors grew weaker. The emperor, once the undisputed ruler of Rome, was now at the mercy of his generals, who were more than willing to overthrow him if it meant gaining power. The number of usurpers, men who seized the throne by force, skyrocketed. The military no longer served the empire. It served only itself. But it wasn't just the military that was in decline. The Roman economy was in ruins, inflation was rampant, and the value of the Roman currency plummeted. The empire had long relied on tribute from conquered territories to sustain itself, but as the borders grew more difficult to defend, these sources of wealth began to dry up. Rome had long relied on its vast network of slaves, but as the economy faltered, the number of slaves available for labor dwindled. Trade routes became more dangerous, and the once bustling marketplaces were now filled with fewer goods. The class divide grew wider. The elite, wealthy Romans, many of whom owned vast estates, continued to thrive. But the plebeians, the lower classes, were sinking deeper into poverty. The people of Rome, once fiercely proud of their city and its accomplishments, began to lose faith in the empire's ability to protect them. Disillusionment spread among the masses, who saw their once great civilization faltering before their eyes. The cultural cohesion that had once bound the empire together was now beginning to erode. The political structure of the Roman Empire, too, was showing signs of decay. The Senate, once a powerful institution, had become little more than a rubber stamp for imperial decisions. The emperor, who had once been a symbol of Roman strength and unity, was now often a puppet of the military. The days of wise, virtuous rulers like Augustus were long gone. Instead, the empire was governed by men more concerned with consolidating their own power than with the well-being of the empire as a whole. Amidst this chaos, several attempts were made to save the empire from collapse. The Emperor Aurelian, who ruled from 270 to 275 AD, achieved a temporary victory by reconsolidating the empire after the crisis of the 3rd century. He reclaimed several territories that had been lost to barbarian tribes, including parts of Gaul and the east. Aurelian also constructed the Aurelian Walls, a massive defensive fortification around Rome designed to protect the city from invasion. These walls, still standing today, were a symbol of the growing vulnerability of the empire. Yet, despite his military successes, Aurelian could not overcome the deep-seated problems that plagued Rome. The empire, though temporarily stable, was still crumbling beneath the surface. By the time Diocletian rose to power in 284 AD, the empire was on the brink of collapse. Diocletian understood that the traditional structure of the empire, one unified under a single emperor, was no longer sustainable. In a move that would later be seen as both brilliant and disastrous, Diocletian split the empire into two halves, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. The eastern half, ruled from Byzantium, later Constantinople, would become the Byzantine Empire and would survive for another 1,000 years. The western half, governed from Rome, was left to fend for itself. This division was not just political, it was also cultural. The East and West had long been separated by geography, language, and culture. While the Eastern Roman Empire embraced Greek language and culture, the West remained firmly Roman. The Eastern Empire, though burdened by its own problems, was more resilient. Constantinople, with its strategic location and thriving economy, would become a cultural and political powerhouse. Meanwhile, Rome and the western provinces continued to suffer from internal decay and external threats. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, took control after Diocletian's abdication and further solidified the divide between East and West. Constantine's reign marked a turning point in Roman history, not just because of his military successes, but because of his decision to embrace Christianity. In 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians and allowing the faith to spread freely throughout the empire. Constantine's move to make Christianity the state religion of the empire was revolutionary and would have far-reaching consequences. Yet, even Constantine's reforms could not stop the decay that had already set in. The Western Roman Empire was sinking under the weight of its own problems. The very institution that had been the backbone of the Roman Empire, the army, was now a source of instability. As the military became more mercenary-based and less loyal to the emperor, the empire's ability to defend its borders dwindled. Invaders from the outside, the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, pressed on all sides. It was not just the external invaders that caused Rome's downfall, it was the disintegration of Roman identity itself. The Roman citizens, once proud of their empire's greatness, no longer believed in the values that had once bound them together. The virtues of pietas and virtus, the virtues of duty to the gods, the family, and the state, began to fade. The identity of Rome, once forged in the fires of conquest and civic duty, became fragmented. The people, no longer united by a common cause, began to turn inward, focused more on personal survival than on the survival of the empire itself. Rome was no longer what it had been. The empire that had once been the greatest force in the ancient world was now a pale shadow of its former self. And yet, even as it tottered on the edge of destruction, the world watched. The fall of Rome was not a single event, it was a slow, agonizing decline that had begun long before the Visigoths sacked the city in 410 AD. But when they did, it was the final, undeniable moment that the Western Roman Empire had ceased to exist. The empire's last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 AD, marking the end of the Western Roman Empire and the beginning of the Middle Ages. Rome's fall was not caused by any single factor. It was the result of centuries of internal strife, economic decay, military decline, and external pressures. It was a slow, relentless process that stretched across generations, each contributing to the empire's eventual collapse. Rome's fall was a tragedy of epic proportions, a story of greatness turned to dust, a lesson for future civilizations in how even the mightiest of empires can crumble under the weight of their own ambitions. And yet, though the Western Roman Empire had fallen, its legacy endured. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would continue to carry the torch of Roman culture for another 1,000 years. The ideals of Rome, law, governance, architecture, and the arts, would continue to influence the world for centuries to come. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but its spirit remained, embedded in the foundations of the modern world. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a singular event. It was the culmination of centuries of slow erosion, decades of internal division, economic ruin, military decline, and external threats that had been building up for years. It was a gradual unraveling of what had once been the greatest empire in history, and the people of Rome, though still proud of their heritage, could only watch as it slipped beyond their grasp. By the 5th century AD, the Western Roman Empire was a shell of its former self. The empire, which had once stretched from the windswept coasts of Britain to the sun-drenched sands of Egypt, now struggled to maintain control over its core territories. The once mighty legions, which had once crushed armies with ease, were now a pale imitation of their former selves. The barbarians, long considered distant threats, had grown bolder. The Roman army, which had once been the very model of discipline and organization, was now composed of mercenaries who fought for pay and loyalty to whoever could offer them the highest wage. Their devotion to Rome had waned. The political system too was failing. The emperor, once the symbol of Roman unity and strength, had become a figurehead, his power often controlled by powerful generals or regional governors. The Senate, once the beating heart of the Roman Republic, was now little more than a shadow of its former self, filled with intrigue and corruption. The empire's once robust economy had been decimated by the twin forces of overexploitation and overexpansion. The taxes needed to maintain the military and the imperial bureaucracy crushed the poor, while the elite grew ever wealthier. Economic mismanagement, combined with inflation, led to the devaluation of currency and widespread poverty. The political fragmentation of the empire was mirrored by its cultural division. The Eastern Roman Empire, now centered in Constantinople, was more resilient. It remained a center of wealth, culture, and military power. It had adapted to the challenges of the post-Roman world and continued to thrive, eventually evolving into the Byzantine Empire. But the Western Roman Empire, with its capital at Rome, was struggling to survive. The cultural unity that had once been so strong in the Roman world was beginning to fade. The Roman identity, which had been built on civic duty, honor, and military discipline, had become fragmented. The connection between the people and the empire was no longer as strong as it once was, and this lack of unity left Rome vulnerable. One of the most significant blows to the empire came from the people who had once been on the fringes of Roman society, the barbarians. The Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other barbarian groups that had long been a source of tension for Rome were now pressing in on its borders. The Visigoths, led by their king Alaric, had been moving through Roman territory for years, seeking a homeland. They had already sacked several Roman cities before their forces finally reached Rome itself. In 410 AD, Alaric and his army, after years of conflict with the Romans, famously sacked Rome. This was a blow that shocked the Roman world to its core. The city that had once been the heart of the greatest empire in history had fallen to a barbarian king. The sack of Rome by Alaric is often considered one of the most iconic moments in the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was not the first time Rome had been taken by outsiders. This was, after all, a city that had faced countless battles and sieges, but it was the first time in nearly 800 years that the city itself had been captured by an enemy. The Visigoth sack of Rome in 410 was a profound symbol of the empire's decline, but it was not the end. Rome would recover from this event, but the damage had been done. The morale of the people had been shattered, and the empire's ability to defend itself was now in question. The once unified Roman Empire, held together by the strength of its legions and its identity as the center of the known world, had lost its sense of invincibility. The imperial authority, already weakened, was now crumbling. For several more decades, the Western Roman Empire staggered on, but it was increasingly irrelevant in the face of growing barbarian power. Rome, though still an imperial city, no longer held the strength to maintain control over its vast territories. The Vandals, another barbarian group, crossed the Mediterranean and eventually captured North Africa, cutting off one of Rome's most important sources of grain. The Vandals then set their sights on Rome itself. In 455 AD, they sailed across the sea and plundered the city, committing atrocities and further demoralizing the Roman populace. The once proud city of Rome, now sacked twice within a generation, seemed to be crumbling under the weight of its own decline. Meanwhile, the Huns, under the leadership of Attila, ravaged vast swaths of the empire. The Huns had become a constant threat along the eastern borders, pushing into the empire's territory with devastating force. The Roman armies, unable to effectively counter the Huns, were forced to retreat. Attila's incursions in the mid-5th century were a brutal reminder of the empire's vulnerability. Though Attila himself would die in 453 AD, his campaigns had shown the Roman world that its military might could no longer keep the invaders at bay. By this point, the Western Roman Empire was on its last legs. The political structure had collapsed, the military had disbanded, and the people had lost faith in the empire's ability to protect them. The last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was a child when he ascended the throne in 475 AD. His reign, though symbolic, would be the last chapter in the history of the Western Roman Empire. In 476 AD, the final blow was delivered. Odoacer, a barbarian chieftain who had once been a general in the Roman army, deposed Romulus Augustulus, marking the official end of the Western Roman Empire. Odoacer declared himself king of Italy, a position that would hold no allegiance to Rome. The West had fallen. Rome, the empire that had once ruled the known world, had crumbled not in a single moment of violence, but through a slow, agonizing decline. The people of Rome had endured centuries of civil wars, military defeats, economic strain, and political upheaval. The empire had stretched itself too thin, divided its forces, and most importantly, lost its unity. The barbarians who had once been the empire's enemies had in the end become its masters. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not just the end of an empire, it was the beginning of the Middle Ages. The darkened streets of Rome, now abandoned by imperial authority, would give way to a new order. The Eastern Roman Empire would continue to carry the legacy of Rome, but the West, now broken and divided, would undergo centuries of turmoil. Christianity, which had spread throughout the empire during the reign of Constantine, would play a crucial role in shaping the future of Europe. But for Rome itself, its glory had faded. The empire that had once conquered the world had been swallowed by time, leaving behind only the ruins of a civilization that had once been the greatest in history. In the centuries that followed, many would look back on the rise and fall of Rome as a lesson, a story of power, pride, and the inevitable decline that accompanies all empires. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is a testament to the fragility of greatness, a reminder that no empire, no matter how mighty, is invincible. Even the strongest civilizations are vulnerable to the forces of time, and eventually, all empires must face their reckoning. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a new era in Europe. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the unchallenged force in the Mediterranean world. Its laws, its armies, its language, and its culture had shaped the course of history. But with its fall in 476 AD, a profound transformation swept across Europe, one that would lay the foundation for the future of Western civilization. In the immediate aftermath of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, Europe descended into a period of confusion and instability. The centralized power that had once provided order and security had vanished, leaving behind a fragmented landscape of competing barbarian tribes and weakened Roman institutions. The great cities of the empire, once centers of trade, culture, and administration, began to decline. Rome itself, once the heart of the empire, found itself abandoned by its former glory. The massive infrastructure that had once supported the empire, roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, began to fall into disrepair. Trade routes became more dangerous, and the cultural vibrancy of the Roman world started to fade. But the fall of Rome did not mean the end of civilization. While the Western Roman Empire was collapsing, the Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive, maintaining much of the Roman legacy. Centered in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire preserved Roman law, Roman military traditions, and Roman culture for another 1,000 years. Constantinople, strategically located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, remained a thriving hub of commerce, learning, and culture even as the West descended into darkness. In the West, however, the vacuum left by Rome's collapse was quickly filled by a new wave of barbarian kingdoms. The Visigoths, who had sacked Rome in 410 AD, established their kingdom in Spain. The Vandals, after their sack of Rome in 455 AD, set up their own kingdom in North Africa. The Franks, under the leadership of Clovis, rose to prominence in what is now France. These barbarian kingdoms, though often considered primitive by Roman standards, began to adapt and incorporate elements of Roman governance, law, and culture. In time, they would form the building blocks of modern Europe. Perhaps the most significant transformation came with the rise of the Franks. Clovis, a Germanic chieftain, became the first ruler to unite most of what is now France under his control. In 496 AD, but he converted to Christianity, which played a crucial role in the unification of his people and the consolidation of his power. Clovis's conversion was not just a personal religious decision, it was a political move that tied the newly emerging Frankish kingdom to the Christian Church, which had become a powerful institution in Europe. This alliance would have lasting consequences, as the Catholic Church would become the central institution in medieval Europe, playing a key role in both politics and society. As the Frankish kingdom expanded, it absorbed many of the traditions and structures of the Roman world. Clovis's successors, notably Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and Charlemagne, built a powerful dynasty that eventually led to the formation of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne, in particular, became a key figure in the restoration of Roman ideals in the West. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, a symbolic act that revived the title of Roman Emperor in the West for the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Charlemagne's empire, though never as vast or as unified as the Roman Empire, sought to restore Roman governance and law. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian Renaissance began, a revival of learning and culture that sought to recover the knowledge and achievements of the classical world. Yet, while the Frankish kingdoms were building a new European order, many of the Roman Empire's core institutions, the Senate, the imperial court, and the military, were gone. The political and social structures that had held the empire together were no more, and Europe entered a period of feudalism where power was decentralized and controlled by local lords. The large centralized empire that had once been Rome was replaced by a patchwork of smaller kingdoms, each governed by its own laws and customs. In this new world, the concept of empire was replaced by the notion of local power and authority. During this time, the Christian Church became the glue that held European society together. As the Roman state had fragmented, the Church had remained one of the few institutions that could maintain continuity. The papacy, headquartered in Rome, became an important political force. The bishops of Rome, particularly the Pope, came to wield significant power, both spiritual and temporal. The Church not only provided religious guidance to the people, but also became the main source of education and learning. Monasteries and convents became centers of scholarship, preserving ancient texts and passing on knowledge that would later fuel the Renaissance. Meanwhile, the barbarian kingdoms of the West, though initially considered crude and unrefined compared to Rome, began to take on a more organized and sophisticated form. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Lombards, who had once been seen as invaders, began to establish stable kingdoms and adopt elements of Roman culture. They learned Latin, adopted Roman laws, and incorporated Roman architecture and urban planning into their new cities. The Roman Catholic Church played a key role in this transformation, as it helped to bridge the gap between Roman and barbarian cultures. Over time, the Germanic tribes would come to view themselves as heirs to the Roman Empire, and the idea of a united Christendom began to take shape. In the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire continued to hold the mantle of Roman power. Under the rule of Emperor Justinian I, the Byzantines sought to restore the lost territories of the West, reconquering parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain. Justinian's most lasting achievement was his compilation of Roman law, known as the Justinian Code, which would influence the legal systems of many European nations for centuries. However, despite these efforts, the Eastern Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. The empire faced constant pressure from both the Persians in the east and the Slavs, Bulgars, and Arabs in the north and south. In time, the Byzantines would retreat into the Balkans and the Anatolian Peninsula, but they remained a beacon of Roman culture for nearly another 1,000 years. For the people of the former Western Roman Empire, life in the post-Roman world was marked by instability and uncertainty. The Dark Ages, as this period is often called, was a time of constant warfare, political fragmentation, and social upheaval. The great cities that had once been centers of learning and commerce fell into decline. The Roman roads, which had once connected the empire's vast territories, became neglected and dangerous. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had left Europe in a state of crisis, and it would take centuries for the continent to recover. Yet even in this period of darkness, the legacy of Rome remained. The Roman language, Latin, became the foundation of the Romans' languages, such as Spanish, French, and Italian, that would dominate much of Europe. Roman law continued to influence the legal systems of Europe, particularly in the Byzantine Empire and later in the Holy Roman Empire. Roman architecture and engineering also had a lasting impact, with many of the techniques and styles developed by the Romans being used in the construction of medieval churches and castles. The Church, too, preserved and transmitted Roman knowledge. Many of the great thinkers of the early Middle Ages, such as Boethius, Isidore of Seville, and Bede, sought to preserve the intellectual heritage of Rome, translating and interpreting ancient texts for the Christian world. Monasteries, which had been founded as places of worship and prayer, became centers of learning and literacy, preserving ancient manuscripts and teaching the next generations. As the centuries passed, the legacy of Rome continued to shape the world. The Carolingian Renaissance in the 9th century, the Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries, and the rise of powerful European kingdoms all carried forward aspects of Roman culture. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had brought about a profound transformation in Europe, but it also ensured that the legacy of Rome, its culture, law, and institutions would live on in new forms, shaping the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD marked the end of an era, but it did not signal the end of the Roman legacy. While the Western Empire crumbled into a period of fragmentation and chaos, the ideas, institutions, and values of Rome continued to shape the trajectory of European history. Though the empire had been toppled by barbarian invasions and internal strife, the cultural and intellectual foundations it laid were far from obliterated. In fact, its influence would persist and be felt across centuries, from the rise of medieval kingdoms to the intellectual flourishing of the Renaissance. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's collapse, Europe descended into the Dark Ages, characterized by political disunity, the decline of cities, and the fracturing of knowledge. The great Roman roads fell into disrepair, and the once thriving trade routes were disrupted. Cities that had flourished under Roman rule shrank in size, and many Roman institutions, from schools to the bureaucracy, faded into obscurity. Yet, even in this time of turmoil, remnants of Roman civilization remained embedded in the fabric of Europe. The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire, became the custodian of Roman knowledge and traditions. Situated in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire was the spiritual and political successor to Rome in the East. Although the empire was a shadow of its former self, it preserved much of what was great about Rome: Roman law, military organization, and culture. The Justinian Code, a compilation of Roman law under Emperor Justinian I, was one of the most enduring legacies of the Byzantine Empire. It preserved the Roman concept of legal order and influenced legal systems in Europe for centuries. This codification of law provided a stable foundation for future European legal structures, shaping both medieval and modern jurisprudence. While the Eastern Roman Empire preserved many of Rome's physical and intellectual legacies, it was in the West that the Carolingian Empire would emerge as a major force in attempting to revive Roman ideals. The Franks, led by Charlemagne, sought to recreate the glory of Rome. Charlemagne, crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in 800 AD, positioned himself as the heir to the Western Roman Empire, re-establishing the imperial title in the West. Though Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire was not a true continuation of the Roman Empire, it represented a powerful claim to Roman authority and sought to bring together the fragmented kingdoms of Europe under a single banner. Despite its attempts, Charlemagne's empire was short-lived, but it left a lasting impact. The Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and culture under Charlemagne, sought to recover much of the knowledge and artistic achievements of the Roman world. Schools were established, the Latin language was preserved, and classical texts were copied and studied. Though the empire itself fragmented after Charlemagne's death, this rebirth of learning laid the groundwork for the later Renaissance. In the wake of Rome's collapse, the Roman Catholic Church emerged as one of the most important institutions in Europe, holding both spiritual and temporal power. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, the Church became the glue that held medieval society together. Pope Gregory I and his successors worked to solidify the Church's influence, while monasteries became centers of education, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world. The Church not only provided spiritual guidance, but also became an administrator of justice, a provider of charity, and a protector of the poor. The Church also played a central role in preserving and transmitting Roman knowledge. The monastic orders, particularly the Benedictines, took on the task of copying and preserving ancient manuscripts. Latin, the language of Rome, became the language of learning, scholarship, and the liturgy of the Church. Without the efforts of these monastic scholars, many of the great works of Roman literature, philosophy, and science would have been lost to history. The rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, particularly after Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, had a profound impact on Roman society. The empire's eventual adoption of Christianity was not just a religious change, it was a social and political shift that would influence the structure of medieval Europe. The Church, as an institution, inherited much of the organizational framework of Roman governance. Bishops, priests, and monks took on roles akin to those once filled by Roman officials. The division between church and state, which had been central to the Roman world, began to blur as the Church assumed significant political power during the Middle Ages. Christianity also transformed the social fabric of Europe. The concept of charity and care for the poor, values promoted by Christianity, were rooted in Roman ideals of civic duty, but took on new importance in the medieval period. The Church played an integral role in providing care for the sick, feeding the hungry, and offering education to the less privileged. The Church's influence in these matters laid the foundation for the development of welfare institutions and social care in the Western world. While the Church helped preserve the legacy of Rome, Roman architecture and engineering continued to influence the buildings and structures of the medieval world. Although many of Rome's monumental buildings fell into ruin, the architectural principles the Romans developed were far from forgotten. The arch, vault, and dome became central to medieval and later Renaissance building projects. Romanesque architecture, which flourished in the 10th and 11th centuries, drew heavily on Roman designs, and the Gothic architecture that followed in the 12th century was built upon these innovations, creating towering cathedrals with magnificent vaulted ceilings and flying buttresses. Roman architecture also continued to inspire the design of churches, many of which incorporated Roman elements like basilicas, columns, and courtyards. The Pantheon, with its massive dome, became a model for later domed buildings, particularly in the Renaissance. Roman engineering, particularly the Roman roads, bridges, and aqueducts, had a profound influence on medieval infrastructure, although it would take centuries for Europe to fully rebuild its once impressive system of transportation and water management. As the centuries progressed, Rome's influence on the Renaissance became even more apparent. The Renaissance, beginning in the 14th century, was in many ways a rebirth of classical ideals. Artists, architects, and scholars looked back to Rome for inspiration, reviving Roman methods of artistic expression, civic organization, and philosophy. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael were not just artists, they were intellectuals who sought to combine the best of the ancient world with the emerging modern world. The Renaissance marked the return to the study of classical antiquity, a movement known as humanism. Thinkers like Petrarch and Erasmus sought to recover and preserve Roman texts. The rediscovery of Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca shaped Renaissance philosophy and political thought, reviving ideas about virtue, civic responsibility, and the ideal republic. This intellectual movement would lay the foundation for the Enlightenment, which further developed the Roman ideal of reason and the rule of law. In the United States, the influence of Rome could be seen in the very founding principles of the nation. The Founding Fathers were deeply inspired by Roman republicanism, the idea of a government in which power was vested in elected representatives rather than a single ruler. The architecture of Washington, D.C., with its columns, domes, and public buildings, was explicitly designed to reflect the grandeur of Roman civic structures, especially those seen in ancient Rome and later in the Renaissance. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Roman Empire is its contribution to the idea of empire itself. The Roman Empire established a model for governance, military organization, and administration that would influence imperial ambitions throughout history. Even as new powers rose, such as the Holy Roman Empire, the British Empire, and Napoleon's French Empire, the example of Rome remained a symbol of imperial authority and governance. Rome's downfall did not mark the end of its story. Rather, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the ideals, culture, and institutions of Rome continued to influence the course of European and world history. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire gave way to new forms of governance, culture, and civilization, but these were often built upon the foundations laid by the Romans. In the end, the fall of Rome is not just a story of decline, it is a story of transformation. The empire may have fallen, but the ideas and achievements that Rome produced continued to shape the Western world for centuries. Rome's legacy lives on not just in the ruins that still stand today, but in the values that continue to guide modern civilizations: the rule of law, republicanism, civic duty, and the pursuit of knowledge. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the content, then please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.